On the quiet morning of June 19, 2003, a rural property known as Burnt House Farm became the setting for one of the most infamous and heart-wrenching episodes in British criminal history. It was an event so intense, so singular in its cruelty, that it would take nearly 2 decades for the full scope of justice to be realized. At the center of this storm was Brian Waters, a man whose life was defined by a sharp, dangerous duality. To his neighbors and his beloved family, he was a dedicated provider, a father who would sacrifice anything to ensure his children had what they needed. But beneath the surface of domestic normalcy, Brian was entangled in a high-stakes underworld operation that would eventually demand the ultimate price. Before the shadows of the illicit trade consumed him, Brian had spent his adult years building a legitimate life in the construction industry. He was a hard worker, respected for his trade, until a severe career-ending injury forced him off the site and out of a job. As the months turned into years, the financial pressure mounted. With a household to support and bills piling up, the desperation of his circumstances pushed him toward a decision that would alter his family's future forever. In the mid-1990s, Brian turned away from the brick-and-mortar world he knew and entered the lucrative, yet perilous world of cannabis cultivation. It was a pivot born of necessity, but Brian proved to be adept at it. By 1998, he was managing operations that spanned across borders, spending significant time in the Netherlands to oversee his growing enterprise. It was during these frequent trips across the Channel that his path crossed with John Wilson, a 54-year-old underworld figure based in Derbyshire. Wilson was a man who commanded respect through intimidation, a seasoned operator in the grey zones of the law. Initially, their arrangement was mutually beneficial. Brian began utilizing his established routes to act as a broker and a courier, moving product and funds between the UK and Holland, taking a cut for every successful transport. However, the fragile alliance between the two men shattered in the summer of 2002. While navigating through a port in Amsterdam, Brian was intercepted by customs officials. He was carrying $20,000 in cash funds that belonged to John Wilson. Unable to provide a legitimate source for the money, the authorities seized the entire sum. In that moment, Brian's fate was sealed. In the months that followed, the tension between the two men curdled into open hostility. Brian, perhaps underestimating the danger he was in, made the fatal error of ignoring Wilson's attempts to contact him. He behaved as if the debt had been a business loss, rather than a personal slight. But for Wilson, this was not merely a financial discrepancy, it was a challenge to his reputation. Rumors began to circulate that Brian had established a new secret grow site in Cheshire. For the crime boss, the idea that his debtor was making money while refusing to repay him was an insult that could not stand. Wilson decided that a simple collection was no longer enough. He needed to send a message that would echo through the underworld. To execute a plan of this magnitude, Wilson required more than simple intimidation. He needed precision, patience, and a skill set that went far beyond the typical capabilities of street-level enforcers. He needed to find a needle in a haystack, a secret location designed specifically to remain hidden from the law. To achieve this, he enlisted the services of two cousins, Christopher Guest Moore Jr. and James Raven. These men were an anomaly in the criminal underworld. On the surface, they possessed a veneer of professional legitimacy that made their involvement all the more disturbing. Both men had backgrounds in surveillance and covert operations, having worked as undercover researchers for major television networks, including the BBC and Channel 4. In a twisted irony, the very skills they had honed to expose criminal networks for documentary programs were now being utilized to facilitate a grave criminal enterprise. They were experts in the art of deception, capable of blending into the background, watching without being seen, and gathering intelligence with methodical efficiency. Despite their respectable resumes, the cousins were deeply embedded in the darker side of Cheshire's social fabric. They were not merely hired hands. They were well-compensated specialists, reportedly earning substantial sums for their unique brand of investigative work. For this particular assignment, their target was not a story, but a family. By June 2003, the cousins had turned their gaze toward Brian's son, Gavin. They believed that the younger Waters was the key to unlocking the location of the hidden cannabis operation. For days, they shadowed him through the streets of Nantwich, tracking his movements with the persistence of predators stalking prey. It was a calculated game of patience, and on June 10th, that patience finally yielded results. The surveillance team followed Gavin as he drove to his father's residence, lingering at a distance as he made a brief stop. When Gavin departed, he led them unknowingly to the prize they had been seeking, Burnt House Farm. The location was perfect for the illicit activities Brian was conducting, but it was also terrifyingly perfect for what Wilson had planned. Isolated and set back from the main road, the farm offered the privacy necessary for a cannabis yield, but also the seclusion required for a severe interrogation. Once the location was identified, the surveillance intensified. Christopher and Raven did not strike immediately. Instead, they spent the following days studying the rhythms of the property. They monitored the comings and goings, noting who was present and when. They were building a complete picture of the daily routine at Burnt House, ensuring that when they finally made their move, there would be no surprises. They were waiting for a specific convergence of events. They needed to know exactly when Brian would be on site. The cousins visited the perimeter of the farm repeatedly, gathering every detail, from the layout of the buildings to the optimal entry points. As the middle of June approached, the trap was set. The intelligence had been gathered, the crew was assembled, and the stage was prepared for a confrontation that was intended to recover a debt, but would ultimately spiral into a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. The watchers in the shadows were ready to step into the light. The morning of June 19th dawned with a deceptive sense of normalcy for the Waters family. At their home in Nantwich, the atmosphere was one of celebration. Brian's daughter, Natalie, had just turned 21 the day before, and the family was still riding the high of the occasion. Brian, ever the diligent worker, had his mindset on the tasks ahead. The fields at Burnt House Farm were quiet, the crops ready for inspection. He planned to make a brief, routine stop to check on the harvest before returning to his life as a father and husband. But as he prepared for his day, a sinister convoy was already moving through the Cheshire lanes, destined to intercept him. Christopher and Raven had assembled a formidable crew for the operation. They enlisted Otis Matthews, a known figure from Stretford, and David Moran, a drifter with no fixed address, along with 3 other unidentified men who, to this day, remain ghosts in the case file. The group traveled in a stolen horsebox, a vehicle chosen for its ability to blend into the rural landscape while concealing the dark intent of its passengers. When the heavy vehicle rumbled into the yard of Burnt House Farm, the men wasted no time. Donning balaclavas to mask their identities, they breached the property, initially tearing through the rooms in a frantic search for anything of value. Yet, this was far more than a simple burglary. They were setting the stage for an ambush. The first person to walk into their carefully laid trap was not Brian, but Suleiman Razak, the son of Brian's business partner. Arriving at the farm to assist with the work, Suleiman found himself instantly overpowered by the masked intruders. There was no conversation, no warning, only sudden, overwhelming force. He was dragged into a disused cowshed adjacent to the main building, a cold, concrete space that would soon become a chamber of intense suffering. The gang demanded answers regarding the location of the money, answers that Suleiman simply did not possess. What followed was a sequence of enforcement tactics designed to break the human spirit. Suleiman was bound by his ankles and hoisted into the air, suspended from the rafters like livestock. Beneath him stood a barrel filled with stagnant, filthy water. Repeatedly, the assailants submerged his head, holding him under until his lungs burned for air, before hauling him back up to face their questions. The physical interrogation escalated with terrifying creativity. High-voltage electrical shocks were administered to his body, sending convulsions through his limbs, while the men poured caustic chemicals onto his skin, leaving severe burns. A staple gun was used as a weapon of compliance, each trigger pull a demand for information he could not give. Finally, battered and barely conscious, he was taped to a chair, a silent hostage, in a room, waiting for the main target. By 1:00 p.m. the trap was fully primed. Brian Waters pulled his truck into the farmyard, unsuspecting of the nightmare that lay behind the closed doors of the shed. He noticed the unfamiliar horsebox parked near the entrance, an anomaly that sparked a flicker of suspicion. But curiosity, or perhaps concern for his property, drove him forward. As he stepped out of his vehicle and moved toward the building, he was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The silence of the farm was a lie. Inside, 6 men were waiting, their patience finally at an end. The realization of danger struck Brian the moment he crossed the threshold, but the opportunity to retreat had already vanished. As he attempted to flee, the masked enforcers pounced, their movements coordinated and ruthless. He was dragged by force into the same cowshed, where Suleiman Razak was already being held, the heavy doors sealing the outside world away. What transpired next was a systematic dismantling of a man, driven by a cold, transactional demand for the 20,000 debt. The violence was unrelenting. Brian was subjected to severe physical enforcement, his body struck repeatedly with canes, until the evidence of the assault was visible across his back and chest. The gang utilized the same terrifying methods they had practiced on Suleiman. Brian's head was forced into the container of stagnant liquid, the water filling his airways as his attackers demanded payment. He was suspended from the beams, his body inverted in a position of total vulnerability, while industrial staples were driven into his skin. The cruelty escalated to a point beyond description. In an act of ultimate violation, an iron implement was used to inflict catastrophic internal trauma, an injury that pathologists would later determine caused unimaginable suffering, and played a significant role in the tragic outcome. His pleas for mercy echoed off the concrete walls, but they fell on deaf ears. As the afternoon wore on, the tragedy deepened. Unaware of the horror unfolding inside the shed, Brian's children, Gavin and Natalie, arrived at the farm. They walked unsuspecting into the heart of the ambush. Gavin was immediately set upon, struck down and pinned to the ground. A ligature was tightened around his neck, restricting his airflow to the point of near unconsciousness. Natalie was subjected to her own distinctive terror. A firearm was forced into her mouth, the cold steel, a promise of what would come if she did not comply. Both siblings were forced to witness the heartbreaking state of their father. Brian was slumped in a chair, his breathing ragged, his body broken. At one point, amidst the chaos, Brian gasped to his captors that he could not breathe, begging for the restraints to be loosened. One of the men obliged, but the gesture came too late. The cumulative toll of the injuries, the internal trauma, the multiple fractures to his ribs, the collapsed lung was simply too great for his body to withstand. In front of his own children, Brian Waters succumbed to his injuries, his life extinguishing in the damp, dark air of the milking parlor. His remains were callously dragged across the floor, discarded like debris. The nightmare, however, was not confined to the farm. While the family lay bound and traumatized, 2 of the assailants took Brian's truck and drove to the family home in Nantwich. They forced their way inside, confronting Brian's wife, Julie. After ransacking the house in a futile search for cash, they abducted her, driving her back to Burnt House Farm. She was delivered into the same hellscape that had already claimed her husband and entrapped her children. The entire family was now held captive in a tableau of devastation, their lives shattered by a debt that had spiraled into a fatal obsession. While the devastation unfolded inside the farmhouse, a bizarre and calculating act of deception was taking place just outside. David Moran, stationed as the lookout for the gang, picked up his phone and dialed 999. But instead of confessing his role in the siege, Moran adopted the persona of a concerned, innocent bystander. In a calm, detached voice, he told the emergency dispatcher that he had just exited the motorway and spotted something suspicious in the farmyard. It didn't look right, he claimed, describing what appeared to be men attacking someone. It was a chilling attempt to construct an alibi in real time, distancing himself from the savagery he had helped facilitate. He stayed on the line, playing the part of the Good Samaritan, even as his accomplices continued their brutal work mere yards away. Moments later, the arrival of the police triggered instant chaos. The sound of sirens shattered the gang's control, and the men scattered in all directions, sprinting across the open fields in a desperate bid for freedom. James Raven was apprehended near the scene, but in the confusion, the others managed to vanish into the countryside. In their haste to escape, however, they left behind a treasure trove of forensic evidence. The farm was littered with the debris of their crime, on discarded gloves, hats hanging from rafters, and biological traces that would irrevocably link them to the scene. There had been no time to clean up, no opportunity to sanitize the location. The site was a frozen snapshot of the event, waiting to speak for the victim. Justice for the majority of the crew came swiftly. John Wilson, the architect of the plot, and James Raven were arrested and eventually sentenced to life. Otis Matthews faced a more complex legal road, but was ultimately convicted in a retrial. Yet, for the Waters family, the book remained open. One key figure, Christopher Guest Moore Jr., the man who had used his surveillance skills to hunt their father, had slipped through the net. Just days after the tragic event, he was captured on CCTV at an airport, boarding a flight to Spain using a false passport. For the next 16 years, he would become one of the UK's most wanted fugitives, a ghost haunting the edges of the case. While the Waters family tried to piece together their shattered lives, Moore Jr. was living a life of affluent leisure. Adopting the alias Andrew Christopher Lamb, he traversed Europe, eventually settling in Malta, and later the Costa del Sol. He built a new existence as a successful businessman and yacht captain, hiding in plain sight within the luxury enclaves of the Mediterranean. He believed he had outrun his past, that the distance of time and geography had washed his hands clean. But the investigators never closed the file. In 2019, the breakthrough finally came. Intelligence traced the fugitive to his hideout in Malta, and a coordinated international operation brought his 16-year run to an abrupt end. Extradited back to the UK, Moore Jr. faced a jury in 2021. He attempted to spin a fantastical narrative, claiming his presence at the farm was part of an undercover media investigation into police corruption. The court, however, saw through the fabrication. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life, finally closing the last chapter of a story that had begun nearly 2 decades earlier. The verdict brought a legal conclusion to the case, but for Julie, Gavin, and Natalie, the sentence was merely a footnote. The loss of Brian Waters, a father, taken in the most heart-wrenching of circumstances, left a void that no court judgment could ever fill. Justice was served, but the scars of Burnt House Farm would remain forever,